The tank destroyer is already burning. Black smoke pours into the winter air, thick and oily, drifting low across the frozen field. Flames crawl out of the open fighting compartment, igniting loose ammunition with sharp echoing cracks. The metal hull groans as it heats, every second threatening an explosion. German infantry move through the smoke. They come in disciplined lines, rifles ready, boots crunching through frost and churned earth. Their voices carry, short commands, confident, close. The American position ahead of them has already collapsed. Orders to retreat were given minutes ago. The line is supposed to be empty. But one man is still here. He is wounded. Blood darkens his trouser leg where shrapnel tore through flesh. His radio hisses with static and distant artillery fire. Somewhere behind him, his unit is pulling back, believing this ground is lost. He does not follow. Instead, he climbs onto the burning vehicle. The steel is hot beneath his gloves. Smoke fills his lungs. From this exposed perch, he looks out across the field at an entire German assault force advancing toward him, far more men than he can possibly stop. He knows the odds. He knows what doctrine says should happen next. And then, he opens fire. Alone on a burning machine, Audie Murphy makes his stand. Audie Murphy never looked like he belonged on a battlefield. He was small even by civilian standards, thin shoulders, narrow frame, a boyish face that made strangers underestimate him. When he tried to enlist after Pearl Harbor, the Marine Corps turned him away. The Navy followed. Even the Army hesitated. He was underage, underweight. On paper, unsuitable for war. But the war didn't care about paper. Murphy kept trying until someone finally said yes. And once he was in uniform, something began to change, not in how he looked, but in how he endured. He learned quickly. He listened more than he spoke. And when combat came, he did not freeze. He saw his first reel. Fighting in Sicily, then Italy. He learned what artillery sounded like before it landed. He learned how quickly confidence could vanish under fire. He learned that survival often depended on moving when others hesitated. Men around him were wounded, killed, replaced. Murphy stayed. By the time Allied forces pushed into France, his appearance no longer mattered. What mattered was that he kept showing up when things went wrong, when a position was under threat, when someone had to move forward into danger instead of away from it. He didn't talk about courage. He didn't chase medals. He simply did what had to be done, again and again, until responsibility found him, whether he wanted it or not. And in the winter of 1945, that responsibility would place the smallest man in the company at the center of a fight. No one should survive. January settled over eastern France like a weight. The cold in Alsace was not dramatic. It was relentless. It crept into boots and gloves, stiffened fingers around rifle stocks, froze breath into pale clouds that lingered just long enough to give away a position. Men slept in shallow foxholes hacked into frozen ground, waking stiff, exhausted, and already cold again. On the map, this sector looked quiet. The frontier curved through farmland and thin woods, far from the headlines of major offensives. But quiet did not mean safe. The German army, battered but not broken, was preparing one final push in the west. If they could rupture the Allied line here, even briefly, it might buy them time they no longer had. Murphy's unit was stretched thin. Replacements were scarce. Many of the men had been fighting for months without real rest. Equipment was worn, ammunition carefully counted. Every position depended on the next one holding. The terrain offered little comfort. Open fields left defenders exposed. Tree lines that promised cover could just as easily hide an approaching enemy. Fog clung low to the ground in the mornings, swallowing distance and distorting sound. At night, the front felt too quiet. A distant engine, a muffled thud, a flare rising somewhere far off. Each sound carried questions no one could answer. The men sensed it before any orders came down. Whatever the Germans were planning, it was coming here. And when it did, there would be nowhere to hide. The first German shells fell just after dawn. They came in methodically, not as a sudden barrage but as careful testing fire, rounds walking across the American positions, each explosion slightly closer than the last. Earth and ice sprayed into the air. Foxholes collapsed. Men pressed themselves deeper into the ground, counting seconds between impacts. Then The mortars joined in. The fog that had hung over the fields now worked against the defenders, muffling sound and swallowing distance. It was impossible to tell how close the enemy really was. Reports began to filter down the line, movement in the woods, shadows between. The trees, engines heard but not seen. Murphy moved between positions as best he could, crouched low, shouting short instructions over the noise. He checked fields of fire, repositioned a machine gun, reassured men who could not see what they were meant to stop. He had no official authority over most of them. That didn't matter. When a runner arrived with news that German armor had been sighted moving toward their sector, the message landed like a physical blow. Tanks meant this was no reconnaissance, no limited probe. This was a deliberate assault. Minutes later, the order everyone dreaded came through. Prepare to withdraw. The line had done its job as long as it could. Staying meant being overrun. Units began pulling back in stages, firing as they went, trying to avoid panic. Through the fog, German infantry finally appeared. Dark figures advancing steadily, rifles raised, confident now that the American resistance was weakening. The line didn't break all at once. It bent. And in that bend, Audie Murphy made a choice that would place him alone between the enemy and everything behind him. The German attack did not arrive all at once. It unfolded deliberately, like something rehearsed. Infantry emerged first, dark shapes moving through the fog in loose formation, spreading out as they crossed the open ground. Machine guns opened up from the tree line, their fire cutting low and fast, forcing American heads down. Mortar rounds followed, dropping behind the front positions to isolate them from support. Then the armor appeared. The low growl of engines carried through the mist before the tanks themselves became visible, gray shapes pushing forward with slow confidence. Their presence changed everything. Rifle fire no longer felt sufficient. Every American weapon suddenly seemed too small. Murphy watched as U.S. tank destroyers moved to engage. They fired from exposed positions, muzzle flashes briefly lighting the fog. German rounds answered. Back almost immediately. One destroyer was hit and disabled, another backed away under fire. The battlefield became chaos, smoke, explosions, shouted orders overlapping in confusion. American infantry fought as long as they could, firing from foxholes and shallow cover, but the pressure kept building. German soldiers advanced behind the armor, using it as moving protection, closing the distance with each passing minute. Communication began to break down. Units lost contact with each other. Runners were pinned down or wounded. Orders arrived late, if they arrived at all. Murphy did what he could, redirecting fire, steadying men, filling gaps where positions had gone silent. But the weight of the attack was unmistakable. This was not a skirmish. It was a breakthrough attempt. And slowly, under mounting fire and advancing armor, the American defense began to give way. The moment of collapse was coming. The order came through in fragments. Static-filled words passed from radio to radio, confirmed by runners who arrived breathless and shaken. The position could not be held. German armor was pushing through faster than expected. Staying meant encirclement. The withdrawal had to begin immediately. Murphy relayed the order without hesitation. Squads began pulling back in stages, one position covering another, rifles firing in short, controlled bursts. Men rose from foxholes stiff with cold, dragging wounded with them, leaving behind anything they could not carry. German fire intensified the moment the movement was detected. Machine gun rounds stitched across the ground. Mortar explosions churned the snow into mud and smoke. A tank destroyer trying to reposition was hit and disabled, its crew scrambling clear as flames spread through the hull. Murphy was hit during the chaos. Shrapnel tore into his leg, spinning him to the ground. For a moment, the pain was blinding. Blood soaked through his trousers, steaming faintly in the cold air. A medic shouted for him to fall back, to get treated, to move now while there was still time. Murphy waved him off. He forced himself upright, leaning on his rifle, and looked back across the field. His men were retreating as ordered, disappearing into the fog and tree line. The gap they left behind was widening with every second. Someone had to cover them. Murphy understood what that meant. He ordered the last of his men to pull back farther, to keep going no matter what they heard behind them. Then, alone and wounded, he turned back toward the advancing Germans. The retreat was underway, but the fight was not over. The field fell strangely quiet once the Americans pulled back. Not silent, never silent, but changed. The overlapping rifle fire faded into scattered shots. The shouting thinned. What remained was the steady crack of German weapons and the distant rumble of armor continuing forward, confident now that resistance was finished. Murphy stayed low near the disabled tank destroyer. The M10 sat at an awkward angle, tracks half buried in frozen mud, its engine dead. Smoke drifted lazily from the rear. To the Germans, it looked abandoned, just another piece of wreckage left behind in a hurried retreat. That was exactly what Murphy wanted them to believe. He waited as German infantry moved closer, spreading out across the field, rifles held at the ready but no longer firing blindly. They advanced cautiously, expecting only stragglers, maybe a few wounded men trying to escape. Murphy tightened his grip on his weapon and waited until they were close enough to see clearly. Then he opened fire. The sudden burst shattered the illusion of safety. German soldiers dropped for cover, scrambling behind shallow dips in the ground, shouting warnings to each other. They had expected an empty position. Instead, they had walked into a trap laid by a single man. Murphy shifted positions quickly, firing short, controlled bursts, never staying in one place for more than a few seconds. He made himself sound like more than he was, one gun becoming many in the fog and smoke. From the German perspective, the American line hadn't collapsed after all, and as they hesitated, trying to understand what they were facing, Murphy made his next move, toward the burning machine that would define the fight to come. The tank destroyer was burning now, in earnest. Flames rolled out of the open compartment, fed by leaking fuel and cooking ammunition. Thick black smoke poured upward, visible for miles, a clear marker of destruction on an otherwise gray battlefield. Any trained soldier would have known what it meant. Stay away. Murphy did the opposite. He ran toward the wreck, bullets snapping past him as German fire intensified. He reached the side of the M10 and pulled himself up, metal scorching through his gloves. Inside the vehicle, loose rounds popped and cracked as the heat rose. The entire machine could erupt at any moment. Mounted at the top was a modern .50 caliber machine gun. Murphy swung it toward the advancing Germans and opened fire. The weapon roared, its heavy rounds tearing through the fog, cutting down infantry and punching through cover that rifle fire couldn't touch. German soldiers scattered, diving for the ground, suddenly unsure of how many Americans were still holding the line. From his exposed position, Murphy could see everything and be seen by everyone. He was silhouetted against smoke and flame, wounded leg braced against the hull, firing in long, punishing bursts. German bullets struck the vehicle, sparking off steel inches from his body. Artillery continued to fall nearby, shaking the ground beneath him. Still, he fired. The burning tank destroyer became a fortress, and from its top, one man stopped an attack that should have swept him away in seconds. The Germans did not retreat. They adapted. Machine guns were dragged forward. Riflemen spread wider, firing from multiple angles, trying to pin the lone defender in place. Bullets tore through the smoke around the tank destroyer, striking steel, dirt, and air where Murphy had been seconds before. His wounded leg throbbed with every movement. The heat from the burning vehicle pressed against his back. Ammunition fed into the machine gun faster than he wanted it to. He reached for his radio. Through the crackle of static and distant voices, Murphy began calling in artillery. His voice stayed calm as he gave coordinates, then adjusted them again. The rounds were falling close, too close. Shells began to land around him, heavy impacts that shook the ground and sent debris raining down. Explosions ripped through German formations just yards away, throwing men to the ground, tearing gaps in their advance. The risk was obvious. One miscalculation, one round drifting too far. Murphy would be killed by his own artillery. He stayed on the radio anyway, correcting fire as the Germans pressed forward, refusing to break off. Smoke thickened. The field disappeared behind dust and flame. Shrapnel cut into the tank destroyer, slicing the air around his head. Still, the attack slowed. From the German perspective, the position was cursed, defended by unseen forces, struck by artillery that fell impossibly close, held by a resistance that refused to collapse. Murphy fired until the machine gun barrel glowed hot. And as the minutes dragged on, one terrible reality settled in. His ammunition was running out. Time lost its meaning on the field. There was no clear beginning or end to the fight anymore. Only movement, noise, pain, and the constant need to stay alive. Minutes stretched into something heavier, measured not by clocks but by how long Murphy could keep firing. German infantry kept coming. They advanced cautiously now, no longer rushing, probing for weakness, testing angles. When one group was cut down or driven back, another appeared through the smoke. Murphy shifted constantly, changing position on the tank destroyer, firing from different angles, forcing the enemy to guess where the next burst would come from. His wounded leg burned with every movement. Blood loss made his hands shake. The cold numbed his fingers, even as heat from the burning vehicle pressed against him. His throat was raw from smoke. His ears rang continuously, the roar of the machine gun and nearby artillery blurring into a single endless sound. Still, he stayed. From the German perspective, the defense made no sense. A position that should have collapsed refused to die. Fire came from a single point, yet it felt organized, deliberate, unbreakable. Each attempt to advance was met with violence just precise enough to halt it. Nearly an hour passed like this, an hour of exposure, an hour of pain, an hour balanced on the edge between endurance and collapse. And then, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the pressure began to ease. German fire slackened, movement slowed, orders changed tone. The assault was stalling. Murphy fired the last of his ammunition, scanning the field through thinning smoke, waiting for the moment he knew was coming. Either the Germans would surge forward one final time, or they would finally fall back. It did not end with a final charge. It ended with hesitation. German fire began to thin, not all at once, but unevenly. A machine gun fell silent, then another. Movement in the smoke slowed, then stopped altogether. Where soldiers had been advancing only moments before, they now lay flat or pulled back toward the tree line. Murphy waited, scanning the field, expecting the next rush to come at any second. It didn't. The fog lifted just enough for him to see German troops withdrawing in small groups, dragging wounded, retreating behind cover they had already crossed once. The assault that had pressed forward with confidence now dissolved into caution. The field grew quiet. Murphy climbed down from the tank destroyer, legs trembling as his boots hit the frozen ground. Only then did the weight of the last hour settle fully into his body. The pain in his leg surged. His hands shook uncontrollably. He took a few steps and collapsed. When American forces counterattacked later that day, they advanced through ground that should have been lost. German units that were supposed to hold the line were gone. The breakthrough never came. One man had held it, not with numbers, not with armor, but by refusing to give ground when giving ground was the only reasonable choice. What Audie Murphy held that day was more than a patch of frozen ground. By stopping the German advance in that sector, he bought time. Time the American command desperately needed. Units that had been retreating were able to reorganize. Artillery was repositioned. A counterattack could be planned instead of improvised. When American forces moved forward again, they did not find a breakthrough. They found a German assault that had spent itself, men exhausted, momentum lost, objectives abandoned. The line held. Had it broken, the consequences would have rippled outward, supply routes exposed, rear units threatened, a localized collapse that could have widened under pressure. In war, those small failures are often the ones that cost the most lives. None of that appears in a single moment on the battlefield. It appears later, in casualty lists that never grow longer, in units that are not overrun, in men who survive because someone else stayed behind when retreat was the sensible choice. Murphy never framed it that way. To him, it wasn't about saving a sector or altering a map. It was about the men he ordered to pull back, men who trusted him to give them a chance to live. By the time he was evacuated, the adrenaline had faded. Shock set in. Pain followed. Only afterward did anyone begin to understand what had happened on that field. One man, wounded and alone, had stopped an attack designed to break the line, and the war moved. Or on because of it. The paperwork came later. Long after the smoke cleared and the field returned to silence, officers began trying to put words to what had happened. They counted enemy dead, measured time, compared reports that never fully agreed. The language of citations struggled to contain the reality of a fight that had unfolded in chaos. Eventually, the decision was made. Audie Murphy would receive the Medal of Honor. The citation described fearless leadership, extraordinary heroism, a single soldier holding off an overwhelming enemy force for nearly an hour. It listed facts and outcomes compressed into sentences meant to last forever. Murphy did not argue with it. He accepted the medal the way he accepted most things, quietly, without celebration. In photographs, he looks uncomfortable, almost distant, as if the words being spoken belonged to someone else. To the Army, the medal was recognition. To the public, it became a symbol, proof that one man could stand against impossible odds and prevail. But medals do not capture the weight of smoke in the lungs or the sound of rounds striking inches away. They do not record pain or fear or the moment when survival narrows to a single decision repeated again and again. Murphy never claimed the title of hero. He had done what he believed was necessary, nothing more. And while the medal would follow him for the rest of his life, the memory of that burning tank destroyer followed him more closely still. The war ended on paper months later. For Audie Murphy, it never truly stopped. After returning home, the noise followed him. Sudden sounds sent his heart racing. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams that pulled him back to burning vehicles and advancing figures in the smoke. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow, convinced that danger could still reach him. There was no language for it then, no diagnosis, no treatment, just the expectation that heroes returned whole. Murphy tried to build a life beyond the battlefield. He acted in films, smiled for cameras, played the role the public expected of him, the decorated soldier, the symbol of courage. But behind closed doors, the memories pressed in. Anxiety, nightmares, long stretches without rest. He spoke openly later when few others did. He described the fear that lingered, the guilt, the sense that part of him was still standing alone in the cold, holding a line that never fully disappeared. What he carried was not weakness. It was the cost of enduring something no one should have to endure. The medal remained. So did the weight of what it represented. Audie Murphy survived the war when many did not. But survival, he would learn, was not the same as peace. And the courage it took to face what followed may have been as great as the courage he showed on that frozen field in 1945. The field in Alsace looks ordinary now. The scars are gone. Snow still falls in winter. The land gives no sign that, for 1 hour in 1945, everything depended on whether a single man would stand or fall. History rarely marks its most fragile moments. But that moment mattered, not because it was dramatic, not because it was meant to be remembered. It mattered because when the line bent and began to fail, someone refused to let it break. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because others were counting on him to hold. Audie Murphy did not see himself as a symbol. He saw himself as a soldier who stayed when retreat was the sensible choice, a man who endured because leaving meant others would pay the price. That kind of courage does not announce itself. It does not shout. It does not celebrate. It simply remains, long enough to make a difference, then disappears back into the noise of war. The medals endure, the citations remain. But the truth of that hour lives in something quieter. The men who survived, the line that held, the moment when resolve outweighed fear. Stories like this are not about invincibility. They are about endurance. And if this one is worth remembering, it is because it reminds us how much can rest, even briefly, on the shoulders of a single human being.